3-4 बच्चे घरों को वापस आ गए, फिर आपका सारा ये
कोई नहीं आएगा।
किस तरह आप कहते हैं कोई नहीं आएगा?
शाहीन साहब
किस तरह?
एक मिनट, आपने 200 बच्चे क्यों नहीं कत्ल किए? 100 क्यों? इंतकाम कर रहे थे ना आप, इंतकाम कर रहे थे।
मेरे पास आज भी इतने पैसे थे कि मैं ये सिलसिला जारी रख सकता था।
December 2nd, 1999, Jamil Chishti received a parcel routed to his crime journalism department at Jung. Enclosed, there were pictures of some 57 boys and a diary detailing the rape and murder of 100 boys, along with a letter which read, "I had sexually assaulted 100 children before killing them and had disposed of their bodies in barrels of acid." The sender, it was a 40-year-old man named Javed Iqbal Mughal. Flabbergasted by the bizarre nature of the letter, Chishti decided to investigate the matter. He descended upon the address mentioned in the letter, 16B Ravi Road, but found it locked. After speaking with the landlord, Chishti and his associate scaled a wall to the house shared with the neighbor. Inside there was a repellent smell hanging in the air, along with a few barrels, boys' clothing, and images. Timidly, Chishti opens one of the barrels. The smell of death fills the room. Chishti peers inside. There, floating in acid, were pieces of human flesh. The police were called, who found the aforementioned barrels and clothing along with 14 jerry cans, 2 pieces of a rubber pipe, 2 jars covered with human hair, 2 diaries, one containing names and addresses of 100 boys, the other recorded detailed accounts of their murders, a kara, which is an iron ring, around an amputated leg, an album containing 57 pictures of presumed victims, some posters presumed to be written by Javed, and an ominous iron chain. Despite Javed Iqbal Mughal being the one to send the letter on his own accord, the man himself was nowhere to be found. On one of the posters, Javed had written, quote, "Today, November 25th, 1999, I have decided to commit suicide. Yesterday, I killed my employee, Sajid, and incinerated his body in the container so that he could be punished for theft and for disturbing me again and again. Now I can go to sleep in the depths of the Ravi." The next day, or December 3rd, 1999, Jung, the largest news outlet in Pakistan at the time, published an article, quote, "Claim of murder of 100 kids," end quote. The article was also published with the names and addresses along with the pictures of the presumed victims. Unsurprisingly, the police stations were thrown into utter pandemonium as parents rushed to the stations after either identifying their boy from the article or seeking answers about their missing children. The police, who had previously been strangely dismissive of their worries, now had to bear the responsibility of 100 deaths. With parents raising hell locally and news reporting 100 murders, the international media also picked up the case. Journalists from the BBC, the New York Times, and The Guardian began writing about this on-the-run serial killer, and the police were put under immense pressure. As the police wildly flailed and grasped at straws, jailing anyone even remotely connected with Javed Iqbal and launching the country's most expensive manhunt at the time, their unprofessionalism was being exposed. In a bizarre turn of events, the police had received a similar parcel from Javed a month prior, and upon reluctantly visiting 16B Ravi Road, police found Javed Iqbal Mughal. Javed was calm at first, but as the police began questioning him about the parcel, he became erratic, eventually pulling out his legally owned gun and threatening to kill himself if he wasn't left alone. And so, the police left, without even searching the home. Casting even more doubt on the police, one of Javed's assumed accomplices and a key witness, Ishaq Billah, a 32-year-old man, reportedly jumped out of a window and killed himself while in police custody. However, the autopsy and a later inquiry revealed that Ishaq had been tortured. As a result, the officers in charge were suspended and charged with murder. The police also allegedly tortured those who remained in their custody, including innocent bystanders and family members, before being released following the dubious death of Ishaq. On December 30th, 1999, an unassuming, disheveled, middle-aged man with the appearance of a pauper walked into the offices of Jung. There, at the reception desk, he spoke in a calm, well-educated, almost soothing manner. Quote, "I am Javed Iqbal, killer of 100 boys." End quote. This came after the widely reported and public debacle of Ishaq's death. At the same time, police arrested 2 more accomplices of Javed, a 9-year-old boy named Muhammad Nadeem, a 17-year-old young man named Shehzad, alias Sajid, alias Guddu, presumably the same Sajid that Javed had claimed to have murdered earlier. The two were arrested when they attempted to cash a check from Javed. Javed told the employees at Jung that he wished to confess and that the police must not be the ones to arrest him since they would kill him. Instead, he demanded that the country's military, who had overthrown the government at the time, be the ones to arrest him. Complying, the employees called the military, which sent some 100 soldiers to arrest Javed. While waiting for the military, the reporters at Jung interviewed Javed. He had avoided capture by either living among fakirs at a shrine on the outskirts of the capital city of Islamabad or by living in a drainage culvert and a cave. In this hour-long interview, Javed recounted the murders in great detail. He told the reporters that he was assisted by numerous associates, including Ishaq Billah, who had died in police custody. He stated that many of the victims were made to inhale cyanide as they slept. He said, quote, "I myself wore a mask and after about 5 breaths, they would be dead. Then my friends would place the body in a container, then later drain it away." End quote. Javed was without remorse for his actions, saying, quote, "I am a relieved man today." End quote. In a true psychopathic manner, he presented himself as a hero, remarking how easy it was to dispose of the bodies and expressing concern over terrorists utilizing his MO. On January 11, 2000, police would apprehend another alleged accomplice of Javed, a 12 to 14-year-old boy, Muhammad Sabir. It is unclear exactly how and why the police arrested him. More on this later. Pakistan does not have a jury system. Instead, only the judge is responsible for deeming whether or not a man is guilty. Javed Iqbal Mughal, along with the 3 surviving known accomplices, were brought before Justice Allah Bakhsh Ranja. Justice Ranja began the proceedings with a clear contempt against Javed, seemingly having already decided that the accused were guilty. In a little over a month, with proceedings happening every day, in a system that usually took several years to handle even simple appeals, the murder trial was concluded. The prosecution had produced 105 witnesses for the trial, mostly consisting of the families of the presumed victims, along with the trophies that Javed had collected in his home and all the gruesome evidence and reports. Despite the confession letters to the police and the press, and the clear public admissions of guilt, and the overwhelming evidence collected from his residence, Javed and his accomplices entered a plea of not guilty. What followed next was nothing short of a sitcom, albeit in a gruesome context. Javed would flip-flop on his statements, sometimes claiming that the boys were alive, other times claiming that he had massacred them to get revenge, and sometimes claiming that he had staged the whole thing to get public eyes on the issues of runaway children, poverty, and underage prostitution. On March 16, 2000, the judge, after hearing all the evidence brought against Javed and co. and using their confessions as key evidence, found all of them guilty. Javed and Sajid were found guilty on 198 counts respectively of 302A, which is willful murder with death as punishment, and 201, obstruction of justice by suppressing evidence or lying to police officers in a capital offense case. Shaken by the gruesome nature of the crimes, Justice Ranja announced the following sentence. Javed, the 40-year-old, and Sajid, the 17-year-old, were to be strangled with a murder weapon, an iron chain, in the presence of the legal heirs of the victims. They were then to be cut into 198 pieces respectively for their 198 victims respectively. Then their pieces were to be dissolved in the same acid that they used. They were also sentenced to 700 and 686 years. It should be noted that neither the court documents nor the newspapers of the time that I have managed to find ever mentioned that Javed or anyone else was to be hanged from Minar-e-Pakistan. In fact, the only source I found that mentioned this is source 8, which was written 22 years after the sentencing. Muhammad Nadeem and Muhammad Sabir were charged with 13 and 3 counts respectively against Penal Code Articles 308, murder not punishable by death, and 201, obstruction of justice by suppressing evidence or lying to a police officer in a capital offense. Muhammad Nadeem, a 9 or 10-year-old child, was sentenced to 273 years in prison. Muhammad Sabir, a 12 to 14-year-old boy, was sentenced to 63 years in prison. All 4 appealed. Despite the case being seemingly open and shut, it was anything but. First off, the 105 witnesses that the prosecution called either never actually saw Javed Iqbal Mughal or his accomplices with the victims, or were unreliable. The vast majority of the witnesses were family members who could only recognize their boy from the many pictures found at 16B Ravi Road, along with the articles of clothing or shoes that Javed had kept. However, Javed's defense argued that he had invited the boys inside, taken their pictures, and let them go. They argued that the clothing and shoes were simply bought from a second-hand market. Pakistan's forensics was severely lacking at the time, and the country didn't even have a DNA testing facility. As such, no state-of-the-art forensic data could be produced, and the defense argued that the pieces of dead bodies found were actually dummies and the whole scene was staged. The defense also pointed out how come 16B, which was a very small 3-room house in the middle of one of the most populated areas of the city, could be used as a slaughterhouse without any of the neighbors realizing it. Side note, the neighbors did notice a foul smell for many weeks, but dead bodies smell similar to bad sewage. So when the landlord confronted Javed about the smell, in a move out of Dharma's book, he told him that it must be the sewage and paid the landlord to get them cleaned. After this, Javed would drain the dissolved bodies along with the sewage. The defense also pointed out that the few key eyewitnesses that the prosecution had brought to stand had completely unreliable testimonies. One Tariq Mahmood, a rickshaw driver, claimed to have recognized Muhammad Nadeem, the 9 or 10-year-old boy, from a newspaper containing pictures of the suspects when Nadeem hired Tariq to transport 4 jerry cans to Yadgar Chowk. The only problem? No such photographs were ever published. Similarly, Muhammad Faisal, a car mechanic who lived across the street from Muhammad Sabir, the 12 to 14-year-old accomplice, testified that when he asked Sabir where had he been, he got the response, quote, "We bring children, commit their murders, and then throw the dead bodies in the acids. First we commit unnatural offense with them, and then we put an iron chain around their neck, and then we put our knee on their backside, and in this way we committed the murder of that boy. Then the dead body was thrown in the acids." Faisal further testified, quote, "One Javed Iqbal is their ringleader for committing these offenses. I abused him and told him that I will impart this information to his parents, and Sabir took it as a joke." It should be pointed out that abuse here doesn't mean sexually abused, it probably means that he physically struck him. However, the defense pointed out that in his initial report to the police, Faisal had given a different statement, one that did not commit an admission of guilt. Sabir was also found responsible for the death of a boy named Qadir. However, Qadir's brother Essa testified that he never claimed nor recognized Sabir as his brother's kidnapper, and the confessions were not much better. In his confession to the magistrate, Sabir stated, quote, "Javed Iqbal told me that the boy whom I had brought was killed by him and showed me his clothes, which frightened me. He threatened that I will have a similar fate if I tried to run away. Javed Iqbal took me to the room and asked me to put the chain around the neck of the body and strangle him through it. So I did. There, after he undressed him and put his clothes in the drum by the side of my room and put them in the acid, he threatened me that if I tried to run away, my parents and I will be handed over to the police." Sajid, Javed's 17-year-old accomplice, also testified that Sabir was threatened. However, this confession was later proven to be inadmissible. All 3 charged accomplices were illiterate and did not understand the intricacies of the law. At least Sabir and Nadeem did not know that their confessions, which were given to a magistrate, could be used against them. Further, they were given no time to think when their confession was recorded. Also, the magistrate used judicial terms which none of them knew and thus couldn't understand. This was in violation of the prerequisites for an acceptable confession. Additionally, Muhammad Nadeem, who confessed that he was in charge of bringing the boys to Javed and would be present during the sodomy or rape and murder, was kept in police custody illegally for 13 days before being brought before a magistrate for the judicial remand, court's custody, which was far greater than the 24-hour limit, and thus his confession was also proven to be inadmissible. Both Sabir and Nadeem's appeals were accepted and they were released in 2007 with their record cleared. It is unknown what became of them after that. I unfortunately could not find Javed Iqbal Mughal and Sajid's appeals. The 2 died before the appeal even reached the appropriate authorities, found hanged in their prison cells. They had used their bed sheets to construct a makeshift noose. An autopsy later revealed that both had been tortured and strangled. Their necks were splashed with blood, and the guard on duty on the night of the deaths claimed to be asleep when the pair supposedly committed suicide. Investigators deemed their deaths as suspicious and speculated foul play. It is unclear whether any charges were filed. It is most likely that fearing Javed and Sajid's appeals would be accepted, or as proposed by some, that Javed would implicate some politicians or powerful people, the prison guards cheated the hangman and killed them both. This wouldn't be surprising since the police had already killed Ishaq Billah. However, one should remember that Javed had a history of making suicidal threats and had possibly made numerous such attempts in prison. It should also be noted that the torture signs on his body were signs of beatings, which could have been inflicted upon him by fellow inmates for his hebephiliac and homosexual nature and heinous crimes. Still, Most Pakistanis, including former law enforcement officers, hold the opinion that Javed was killed by the guards. The death of Javed had an unforeseen consequence. We didn't understand his psyche. At the time, and even now, many Pakistanis just call him insane. But it is essential to understand how his mind works so that we may quickly recognize any such behavior and, in a perfect world, rehabilitate. Javed Iqbal Mughal was born in a wealthy family. His father was a successful businessman who potentially had ties with some powerful people in the government. Javed was an avid reader and from a young age would also write for some magazines. It was an open secret that he was a homosexual and no one was ready to accept that. He apparently would get into fights with the neighborhood kids. A cousin stated that Javed would sometimes go into a trance where he would wake everyone in the house and force them to line up behind him. Perhaps Javed wanted to be in control, having been rejected by his family and his peers. Perhaps he targeted children because he wanted to have total control over his victims and because he wanted to exact revenge on his childhood bullies. Another thing to note is that serial killers have this void inside of them which they desperately try to fill. But no matter what they do, the void is never filled. They are never satisfied. Thus, they start with small stuff like dolls and keep escalating to fill the void, killing animals, rape, murders, torture, and finally, taunting police and media. Neighbors and friends say that as Javed entered his 20s, he began showing signs of hebephilia. Javed was given some of the best education the country had to offer and started his own business in '78, a steel recasting business that he operated out of one of the many properties owned by his father. There, Javed would employ boys and would live with them. Javed would often write to underage boys. He would spoil them with gifts, sometimes with cash, and ask for their pictures. He would often send his own pictures as well. It is believed that he would shortlist boys which he found attractive and attempt to get them to visit him, where he possibly intended to have sex with them, consensually or otherwise. Javed's address would be written with a variety of colored ink and sprayed with perfume. Javed didn't do much to hide his desires. He owned a 200cc motorcycle which he would presumably use to lure boys wanting a ride. Javed would also often boast about his money and power. He would often tell strangers how he knew many powerful people, and there is some merit to this. First, Javed came from a wealthy family who probably knew political and government figures. Second, Javed once set up a flea market which required government approval, and in Pakistan, government approval is near impossible unless you have at least some connections. Considering that Javed was a well-known hebephile and a reckless person, it's possible he knew some powerful people who helped him get that market. He also had his own magazine called Anti-Corruption, where he interviewed high-ranking police officials, and also invited a politician to the opening of his flea market. According to Javed, a religious healer had told his very religious family that, quote, bad things, end quote, would happen if he was forced to marry a woman. Despite this, Javed was actually married twice, both of whom he married of his own accord evidently, but both ended in divorce within a few years. Strangely enough, Javed had a child each from his wives, a daughter and a son. This is of particular note since by all accounts, Javed was a homosexual who exclusively had sex with minors. Both marriages were with sisters of Javed's boy employees. The goal of the marriages was supposedly to ensure that the boys wouldn't leave him. In late 1990, the father of a young boy filed a complaint against Javed. The father alleged that Javed had raped his boy. The police investigated the matter, but Javed was never indicted. Unfortunately, we have differing accounts on what happened. Let us consider both. The easier, simpler one is, Javed used his money and powerful connections to bribe and hush up the police and the victim's family. The more complicated account is, the police arrested Javed's father and two of his brothers, who remained in custody for 7 days with no sign of Javed. On the 8th, the police arrested one of Javed's boys, and at once, Javed emerged. He argued with his family, who had presumably been released at this point, hurling insults at them because they let the police arrest one of his boys. Then, Javed surrendered to the police to secure the release of the boy. I believe that both accounts are true, that the police arrested Javed's family and boy, and after surrendering, Javed used his money and power to get out of the situation. This is important as this explains why the police did not immediately arrest Javed when he claimed to have killed 100 boys, and also shows why the police never indicted him for any of the sodomy or rape charges. It should be noted that reporters have claimed that it was here that the relationship between Javed and his family soured. However, Pakistani families aren't the most accepting. They have a tough love culture about them, and parents often verbally abuse their children throughout their childhood, with some making the abuse even harsher as the child grows up. Particularly in the 60s and 70s, the years when Javed was a child, this sort of abuse was considered to be soft. Back then, parents would often beat their children and some would even kick them out. Those who grew up in that time period state that they would, quote, never dare to disagree, end quote, with their parents. I should say that though I say parents, I mostly mean fathers. Mothers in Pakistan have always been very sweet and kind to their children. Adding to that, even now, homosexuality isn't looked upon kindly in Pakistan, so Javed's childhood must have been absolute torment. Unable to have any friends, unable to fit in even with his own family. It does not excuse his actions, but it is important to keep this in mind when discussing his life. Thus, Javed probably hated his family and society, further supported by the fact that he didn't bother to surrender for his family, but did so for his boys. Javed is said to have been a lavish spender for his boys. He would buy them new clothes, give them food and housing under his own roof, and would even take them on road trips to popular tourist towns. I doubt that any of the spending or favors Javed did for his boys was out of empathy or love. Rather, I believe it was the result of some selfish desires by Javed on how to ensure that the boys would never want to leave him. He basically showed them that as long as they are with Javed, they would have their fill of luxury and be free from the harassment of police. He was once jailed for 6 months on charges of sodomy, but the punishment had no effect on him. Javed raped another boy, whose father, a respected man of the community, brought the matter before the community court. A special court in Pakistan called a panchayat. It is presided over by the area's elders. Javed was ordered to go and apologize at every shop in the market. Sometime after that, in 93, Javed's father died. Cause of death is unknown, though Javed must have given him a lot of stress and that probably had an impact. The next time Javed sodomized another boy, he was beaten and expelled from the community. Javed had received a hefty sum of money from his father's estate, totaling to at least 3.5 million rupees. 2 years after that, in 95, Javed constructed a large villa in Rana town. The mansion had a swimming pool in the backyard and a pond in the basement of all places. Javed had 4 vehicles at the time: a Mitsubishi Pajero, a Mitsubishi Lancer, a Toyota, and a Suzuki FX. Presumably after the public thrashing and expulsion from the community, Javed sold his Rana town estate and moved to Fatehgarh. There, Javed would use his money to set up honey traps for the boys. He opened an arcade where he would offer discounts to boys, sometimes letting them play free of charge. He would throw a fair amount of money on the floor and watch as boys bent over to grab the money. He would then claim that the boy had stolen his money and take him to a back room to search. Presumably, Javed would rape the boy and sometimes give him money as a sign of goodwill. Perhaps by giving the boy money, Javed was justifying his actions to himself, that the boy had also gotten something in return. Eventually, children stopped visiting his arcade. Javed then constructed a fish aquarium and a snake enclosure. When that well ran dry, Javed opened a school which he called Sunnyside School. In a turn of events that must have been shocking for Javed. No parent trusted him with their children. Then, Javed would lure children from Data Darbar, a monument to a religious figure where runaway children sought shelter. He would bring them to his home and then rape them at gunpoint. It is important to note that people who rape other people have often underwent severe trauma in their childhood. This suggests that Javed was also traumatized in his childhood and possibly even raped himself. In September 98, Javed hired a 15-year-old masseur. He went on to rape the boy. This young man, however, was not about to take this lying down. He attacked Javed and badly injured him. Javed sustained such severe injuries that he was hospitalized. Initially, the police filed a robbery charge against the boy, but as details came to light, the charges were dropped and Javed was once again charged with sodomy. Javed had sustained a serious head injury and remained in a coma in the hospital for 22 days, where he even had to undergo a surgery. He was arrested as soon as he was discharged from the hospital. To his shock, his family did not pay for his medical bills and all of his estate and businesses were sold to cover them. Javed was now beaten to the brink of death without money and power and in custody of a notoriously harsh police force. It was then that the rapist would turn into a serial killer. Then, Javed would move into the infamous 16B Ravi Road rented property with his aging mother who had taken care of him during his recovery. A few months later, his mother died while Javed struggled with money. Javed then wrote the famous line in his diary, quote, "I decided to make 100 mothers cry, just like my mother cried for me," end quote. Javed began his killing spree in May 99, and we have already discussed how it ended. Curiously, Javed would refer to that hospitalization as the catalyst for his killings. He would tell the police, quote, I did it to avenge an attempt on my life by my boys and the death of my mother and injustice in society. End quote. He wrote in his diary, quote, I was killed that night when I was attacked. End quote. It should be noted that all articles I found from the time, including one by New York Times, present the same narrative. It is unknown exactly when and where did the revenge against police narrative come from. Most likely, it was a result of confusion and similar statements becoming one giant globe of claims by Javed. If you recall, Javed had refused to let police arrest him and instead surrendered to the military. That was most likely amended with the fact that he wanted to get revenge for a beating and with the notoriety of the police, and that he had at one point portrayed himself as a victim to the irregularities in the legal and social system of Pakistan, and boom, he wanted revenge on the police narrative was born. In none of the articles of the time I found did he ever mention that he wanted revenge against the police. He stated that he wanted revenge against the beating he received from the 15-year-old Masoor, some sources say it was 2 of his boys, and the injustice in society, but never did he say the police. This is interesting because Javed had been beaten and jailed and ostracized before, so what was so different this time around? Could it be that Javed was triggered by the loss of his wealth and connections which had given him some amount of control? And further, he was attacked by one of his boys, someone he had presumed would enjoy the sexual acts and possibly even spoiled with gifts, and thus that's why he killed those whom he perceived to be similar? Thus regaining control over those he had controlled before using money? Javed continued to kill and even formed an audience who would at least watch him kill as stated earlier. Javed then sent the confession parcel to the police and a month later to the press. Javed then fled and presumably kept up with the news. When he surrendered at the offices of journalists and gave them an hour-long interview. This is important because the thing about serial killers is that they really want to be liked. For all their narcissism, they are actually very insecure. In their minds, the murders that they commit is incredible work. This is further supported by the fact that Javed would boast about how he got rid of the bodies. However, because they killed the only person who can attest to that fact, they cannot relish in the perceived greatness for long and thus have to kill again. Javed kept increasing his witnesses until eventually, believing what he was doing was so great, so impressive, that the entire nation should be aware of it. Thus, the whole press fiasco. Even after being put in jail and later prison, Javed kept acting as if he were a celebrity. He demanded that the police bring him naan chane, which is a curry dish, and even demanded that he be given a sweater when he felt cold. His demands were entertained. Whenever Javed was interviewed by any members of the press, he had this air of accomplishment about him. He even boasted that he killed 100 boys because that was the pledge he took, making himself appear as honorable. Javed also portrayed himself as a victim on numerous occasions. Perhaps Javed really did think that he was wronged throughout his childhood by society, and then later in his adulthood, when he kept being beaten and charged with sodomy, when in his mind, it was a consensual transaction. Unfortunately, the only man who could have been used to answer our ever-growing questions died in his jail cell 25 years ago.